Nick Lachey was once half of America's favorite couple. Their reality show pulled in over 20 million viewers at its peak, and the world watched their love story unfold in real time. But the cameras never caught what was really happening behind closed doors. Nick stayed quiet for nearly 2 decades, and when he finally spoke, the reason was not what anyone expected. The full story is far more complicated than a simple breakup. When Newlyweds, Nick and Jessica, premiered on MTV in August 2003, it didn't just perform well. It became a cultural moment. On its first night alone, 7.3 million people tuned in. That number kept climbing. By season 2, the show was pulling over 20 million viewers per episode, figures that rivaled primetime network television at the time. On the surface, the setup was simple. 2 young married people, cameras in their home, no script. But the story the cameras were really telling had layers that most viewers never noticed. Nick Lachey was 29 when the show launched. He had spent years as a member of 98 Degrees, a boy band that rode the late 90s pop wave before that wave quietly receded. His debut solo album had come and gone without leaving much of a mark. By 2003, his musical relevance was fading, and he knew it. The show, in many ways, gave him a second platform. Jessica Simpson was 23. She had a different kind of momentum. Her pop career was still climbing, her public profile was expanding, and her father Joe Simpson managed every part of it with close, deliberate control, her contracts, her image, her schedule. Jessica wasn't just a pop star. She was a brand being carefully constructed, one decision at a time. They had married on October 26, 2002, over a year before the cameras moved in. The wedding was presented to the public as a fairy tale. Young, attractive, in love, and now letting America watch. According to a 2004 profile in Rolling Stone, the couple's combined brand, the show, the endorsements, the network deals, generated an estimated $35 million within just 2 years of the premiere. That number matters, because behind it was a quiet and uncomfortable truth. The $35 million wasn't being built equally. Jessica's individual career was driving most of it. Nick was present, charming on camera, easy to root for, but the business was hers. Sources close to the production, speaking years later, noted that the dynamic between the two was rarely balanced. One star was rising, the other was trying to hold his position. Nobody named it out loud. Not then. Millions watched this couple every week and thought they knew them, but did the cameras ever show you the real story? Drop your thoughts below. By 2004, the gap between them was no longer subtle. It was measurable. Jessica Simpson had landed the lead role in The Dukes of Hazzard. The casting confirmed what the industry had already started to sense. She wasn't just a pop star anymore. She was becoming a mainstream entertainment figure with real crossover pull. Her single, These Boots Are Made for Walkin', released alongside the film and sold over 1.2 million digital copies in its first month. That was not a modest number for 2005. That was a statement. Nick's trajectory was moving in the opposite direction. His solo album, Solo, released in 2003, had arrived with quiet anticipation and left with even less noise. It peaked at number 25 on the Billboard 200 and then disappeared from the charts almost entirely. The reviews were polite but unenthusiastic. There was no breakout single, no defining moment. For an artist trying to rebuild his identity outside of a boy band, it was a difficult result to sit with, especially while living inside a television show that was making his wife a household name. The imbalance wasn't just professional. It was seeping into the personal. In her 2020 memoir, Open Book, Jessica wrote about this period with a candor that surprised many readers. She described feeling suffocated, not only by her father's tight managerial grip, but by the weight of what was expected of her as a wife. She felt split in two. One version of herself existed on camera, bubbly, warm, easy to love. The other version existed in private, exhausted, uncertain, and quietly struggling under expectations she hadn't fully agreed to carry. Nick addressed his side of it in a 2006 interview with GQ. He didn't point fingers. But he said something that stayed with people who followed the story closely. He described the marriage as feeling like it had become a business, a structure built around appearances, schedules, and brand decisions rather than the relationship underneath. Neither of them was wrong, and neither was entirely blaming the other. But financial records, later reviewed by entertainment journalists, told a stark story on their own. By 2005, Jessica's individual earnings had outpaced their combined joint income by a ratio of nearly 3-to-1. The money, the momentum, and the public narrative all belonged to her now. The power had shifted, completely and quietly, and the marriage was still pretending otherwise. Most marriages have two people at the center. This one had three. Joe Simpson wore several titles at once. He was Jessica's father. He was her manager. He was her spiritual advisor, a former Baptist minister who had built his post-church identity almost entirely around guiding his daughter's career. According to a 2021 investigative piece by the Daily Beast, multiple former associates described this arrangement as deeply unusual, even by the loose standards of the entertainment industry. It wasn't just that Joe was involved. It was the scope of that involvement that stood out. He held final approval over Jessica's contracts. He controlled which public appearances she made and which ones she didn't. He weighed in on personal decisions that most people would consider entirely private, and he did this well into Jessica's mid-20s. She was a married adult woman, and yet the architecture of her professional and personal life had been built around her father's judgment for so long that dismantling it wasn't simple. It had become the structure she lived inside. Nick felt it. In a 2022 appearance on the Vile Files podcast, he described the marriage as one where a third voice was always present in the room. He was careful with his words. He didn't name Joe Simpson directly in that moment. But for anyone who had followed the timeline closely, the implication required no translation. Jessica was more direct in open book. She wrote that her father's influence had created walls inside her relationships, walls she could feel, but didn't always know how to take down. The control wasn't loud or aggressive. It was structural. It was the default setting she had grown up inside, and stepping outside of it required a kind of self-awareness that takes years to develop. The numbers behind their marriage told their own quiet story. Jessica was 25 years old when divorce papers were filed in December 2005. Nick was 32, 7 years apart in age, worlds apart in career momentum, and operating inside a dynamic where one partner's father held more influence over the marriage than most people ever knew publicly. The age gap, the career gap, the permanent presence of a third authority. Each one alone might have been manageable. Together, they quietly fractured something the public had been sold as unbreakable. But Joe Simpson's role is only part of what eventually came to light. The rest of it took Nick another 17 years to say out loud. Nick's side of the story stayed buried for nearly 2 decades. If you want to hear what he finally said, make sure you're subscribed. The admission in Chapter 5 is unlike anything he said before. For nearly 17 years, Nick Lachey gave the same kind of answer whenever the divorce came up. The words changed slightly depending on the interviewer, but the shape of the response stayed consistent. Measured, diplomatic. He wished Jessica well. He had moved on. These things happen. It was a long time ago. The answers were never cold, but they were never fully open either. They were the answers of someone who had made a quiet decision to keep a door closed. Meanwhile, both of them rebuilt. Nick remarried in 2011. His wife, Vanessa Minillo, had been a television personality and model. Together, they had 3 children. Nick stepped into a lower-profile lane, hosting reality competition shows like The Circle and Love is Blind, formats that kept him visible without placing him back at the center of a cultural conversation. It was a steadier kind of career. Less volatile, less exposed. Jessica's rebuild was on a different scale entirely. She had exited the music industry gradually and redirected her name into fashion. The Jessica Simpson collection grew into something that surprised even industry insiders. By 2019, Forbes confirmed that the brand had crossed the $1 billion revenue threshold, making her one of the most commercially successful celebrity fashion figures in American history. The girl from the reality show had quietly become a business empire. Neither of them, across all those years, publicly blamed the other. Not once in any verifiable interview did either assign fault to the other person directly. To many observers, the restraint felt deliberate, coordinated, even though there was never any public agreement to stay quiet. It simply became the pattern, and the pattern held. Then something shifted in 2024. Nick was 52. He was a guest on a podcast. The setting was informal, the conversation unhurried. And somewhere in the middle of a question about his past, he stopped giving the measured answer. What came out instead was specific, unscripted, and noticeably different from anything he had said in the previous 17 years. He said the marriage had failed because he had lost himself inside it. Not because of betrayal, not because of incompatibility, but because of something slower and harder to name, an erosion of identity that had begun before the wedding and continued quietly until there was nothing solid left to stand on. He pointed to the age of 29 as the entry point. He said he had walked into that marriage already uncertain of who he was outside of his music career. And the cameras, the contracts, and the momentum of someone else's rise had done the rest. The honesty was not loud. It wasn't a confession designed for headlines. It was quiet and precise, the kind of admission that lands harder because it isn't performed. In under 4 minutes, it reframed nearly 2 decades of public assumptions about what had actually gone wrong. But what he said next was the part nobody had predicted. The phrase, "we grew apart," had followed the story for nearly 2 decades. It was the explanation that fit neatly into a headline, required no further detail, and allowed both people to walk away without visible damage. Nick had leaned on versions of it for years. Most people accepted it and moved on. What he said in 2024 was fundamentally different. According to a transcript reviewed from the podcast appearance, Nick stated that he had placed his sense of self-worth almost entirely inside the success of the relationship. Not his career, not his friendships, the relationship. It had become the primary place where he measured whether he was enough. And when that relationship started showing cracks, when Jessica's career began accelerating past his in 2004 and 2005, he didn't respond with conversation or honesty. He withdrew. He pulled back emotionally. He went quiet in the ways that matter. And he traced that pattern directly to his upbringing, to a household where emotional expression wasn't modeled, where feelings were managed privately rather than spoken aloud. He wasn't presenting this as an excuse. He was presenting it as a mechanism, a learned behavior that had operated underneath the surface of the marriage without either of them fully recognizing it until the damage was already done. That level of specificity is rare from a public figure. Vulnerability in interviews is common. Performed vulnerability, the kind that sounds open but reveals nothing uncomfortable, is even more common. What Nick offered was different. It was self-critical in a way that didn't leave room for sympathy-seeking. He wasn't asking to be understood. He was accounting for himself precisely and without softening. The pattern he described has a clinical name. A licensed therapist interviewed by Psychology Today in a 2023 feature on celebrity divorce identified this exact dynamic. One partner's rapid professional success triggering deep attachment insecurity in the other, as one of the most common and least publicly discussed causes of high-profile relationship breakdown. The therapist noted that the affected partner typically responds not with confrontation, but with emotional distance, creating a silence that both people eventually stop trying to cross. Nick's account matched that description almost word for word. He wasn't framing Jessica as the cause. He was mapping his own role with a clarity that took 19 years to arrive at. Most people have felt this at some point, that quiet withdrawal when someone close to you starts outgrowing a version of you both shared. It's more common than it looks on the surface. The divorce was finalized on June 30th, 2006, nearly 4 years after the wedding, nearly 3 years after the cameras first moved into their home and introduced their marriage to 20 million strangers. By the time the paperwork was done, the public had already moved on to the next story. That is how these cycles work. The audience that had invested so deeply in watching them fall in love had quietly redirected that same energy elsewhere. The parasocial relationship ended not with closure, but with distraction. Both of them, in the years that followed, found genuine stability. Jessica's fashion line crossed the $1 billion revenue mark, a figure that placed her among a very small group of celebrities who successfully converted fame into lasting commercial enterprise. Nick built a quieter life, a long marriage, 3 children, a career that no longer depended on being the most recognized person in the room. By most visible measures, both came through it intact. But Nick's 2024 admission does something that no previous interview had managed to do. It quietly repositions the entire arc of the story. What millions of viewers watched between 2003 and 2006 was not simply a couple falling apart under the pressure of fame. According to media scholars writing in the Journal of Popular Culture in 2020, reality television marriages of the early 2000s generated a specific kind of audience investment, parasocial attachment, so strong that when those marriages ended, viewers experienced it as a personal betrayal. That pressure didn't stay outside the relationship, it seeped in. It made honest, private conversation between two people nearly impossible when every interaction existed inside a framework built for public consumption. Nick and Jessica were 29 and 23 when they let the cameras in. Neither had finished becoming who they were going to be. The machine they stepped into wasn't designed to accommodate that kind of unfinished growth. It was designed to produce content. Nick's words at 52 are not an attempt to rewrite history or reassign blame. They are something rarer, a delayed reckoning delivered without performance at a moment when there is nothing left to protect and no image left to manage. It only became possible when the noise finally stopped. Nick's story is one of the cleaner endings, but not every celebrity marriage that played out on camera ended this way. The next video covers one that didn't, and the details are far harder to sit with.